Welcome to the fourth lecture in our series on healthcare communication. This lecture will be broken down into two parts. The first will review most of the resources for the course this week, and the second part will focus on writing tips, structure, active voice versus passive voice, as well as how to go about writing an essay. The first resource for the week, Communicating with Coworkers, reviews a little bit of what we've already discussed, and especially in Lecture 1. I do want to very specifically re-emphasize the importance of closed-loop communication. This is where you say something, and then in order to acknowledge what you've said, your coworker will repeat it back to you. So a great example is if you are taking a doctor's order, let's say for a medication, the doctor might say, Ativan 0.5 milligrams, Q 4 hours, and you will repeat back to the doctor, okay, Ativan 0.5 milligrams, Q 4 hours. And if there is any misunderstanding in that communication, it would be immediately identified because you're repeating your understanding back to the person who originally gave you the message. Using this kind of closed-loop communication dramatically reduces the risk of errors that could negatively impact the patient. You can also use this kind of closed-loop communication when dealing with your patients. For example, they ask for some ice water, and you say, oh, I'll go get you some ice water right now. It helps to show them that you understood exactly what they said, and it shows that you were listening carefully. We've also previously discussed gallows humor, or morbid humor, the jokes that we tell each other as healthcare professionals that generally are not appropriate to say around patients or family members. It's a way of coping with the often difficult stressors that we deal with. And that's not to say that it's wrong, but it is certainly wrong if you're using it in front of your patients. Another very important distinction is to realize that it is okay to poke fun at a patient's illness, but not poke fun at the patient themselves for having the illness. We might make fun of the illness itself, but when you're making fun of the patient's experience of that illness, you're making fun of a person, and that's considered a form of abuse. In skilled nursing, this is really common, where we deal with really difficult circumstances, and it's okay to find a little humor in the same patient that's asking you to help them find their TV remote every 5 minutes for an hour. But it's not okay to be laughing at a patient who's found themselves in their situation because of lifelong alcohol abuse or any sorts of decisions that they made. It's not okay to make fun of the patient themselves for this experience. And this difference might seem very subtle, but through years of practice, you'll learn to see the difference. And until then, just don't make any jokes that are related to your patients. The next resource you have is the Improving Communication Skills, which does a good bit of review from the previous lecture, discussing different factors that influence communication. I want to specifically highlight education level as very important. You should be tailoring your communication with patients based on their education level. So, if you're dealing with somebody who has a doctorate degree in biology, you can use all the jargon that you want. Whereas if someone has not completed high school, you're going to want to make sure that the words you're using are appropriate and that they understand what you're saying. We'll review developmental milestones a little bit further along in this lecture. And finally, we haven't discussed yet, but computerized communication is very different from other forms of communication, and that's become one of the primary ways that people communicate. So you need to be aware that the conversation that you'll use with somebody when you're just speaking in a room is different than what you might want to write in a formal email versus an informal text. We've also discussed the difference between listening and hearing, that hearing is an automatic and passive physiologic process, whereas listening is a conscious, active mental process. It's something that requires effort, attention, and concentration, and it requires a proactive decision to listen. There are many different types of listening, and we'll review those now. There's also something called pseudo listening, which is when you're listening, but something other than the goal of really understanding the person who's speaking is what you're focusing on. So this could be because of laziness, you're just not wanting to put in the effort to listen. Avoidance, perhaps the person is saying something you don't really want to hear. It could be because of poor listening skills. or it could be because you're just pretending to listen. Stage hogging is a common form of pseudo listening, and that's where you're listening essentially only for your ability to then chime in with your own experience. You're changing the focus of the conversation to entirely about yourself. Selective listening is another form where you're only listening for what you care about, perhaps a key word or key phrase. For example, if in this lecture you only cared about the difference between active listening and passive hearing, you might wait until you hear me say the word listening, and then all of a sudden you would perk up and try to hear what I'm saying. There is also insulated listening, which is where you decide what topics you will and will not listen to. And similar to selective listening, as soon as a topic comes up that you aren't interested in, you simply turn your listening skills off. Defensive listening is interpreting others' remarks as an assault on you, taking what they're saying personally, and generally you'll end up responding personally as well, instead of trying to understand the message they're trying to communicate. Similar to defensive listening, but a little bit more aggressive, is ambushing, and that is where you're listening just for specific things you can use against the other person in conversation. As you can imagine, people don't like speaking to an ambushing listener. Our last example of poor listening would be insensitive listening, and that is where you just don't show any regard for the other person's emotions or feelings. And finally, we have active listening. There are different techniques for active listening, and active listening can be impaired by anxiety and all sorts of different things, some of which we discussed in the previous lecture. The different techniques with active listening, we have paraphrasing, which is where you take what they're saying and restate it back to them in your own words so they understand that you understand what they're saying. Then there's clarifying, which is where you ask for a little bit more detail or clarification about something they said. Feedback, which is responding to their ideas. And finally, reflecting feelings, which is where you're trying to show empathy to them by showing that you understand the feelings behind what they're communicating. In order to facilitate good communication, you want to set up a comfortable environment. You want to build a good rapport with your patient by being respectful and using the introductions that we described previously, as well as select a place that has good lighting, proper furniture, and a nice temperature. These areas make it easier to relax and feel unhurried. You want to make sure your patient also has privacy so they feel welcome to share confidential information. And finally, the focus should be on the client. They should be the one that is the center of your gaze and attention. Finally, make a conscious decision about both what you're going to talk about and how much personal space you give the patient. I generally use on the further side of personal space, closer to 4 feet, when I'm talking with patients about something that won't involve me doing any sort of procedure. And I generally go towards the closer end of personal space, about 1.5 to 2 feet, if I anticipate having to touch them at some point later on. Don't be afraid to change this personal space during the course of conversation as well. If the patient seems very comfortable and they're opening up to you, it's okay to get a little bit closer to them and make them feel like you're comfortable with what they're saying as well. Another important concept to consider is territoriality, which is the way that we use nonverbal communication in communicating ownership and occupancy of space. This means that if you think of your space like a little bubble, it's the area that you don't want other people coming into and invading. Examples of this would be if someone steps a little bit too close to you, you might take a step back to show that this is the amount of personal space you would like to maintain. That shows that you're willing to give up a little bit of distance, which is a little bit more submissive than completely standing your ground, but it also gives a good nonverbal cue that you don't want the person any closer to you than they already were. If you find a patient taking a step back after you take a step forward, try to relax your posture and give them back that personal space that you might have just violated. When you're trying to build comfortability with patient, you should avoid the use of cliches and be mindful of the types of questions you're asking. We've discussed previously the difference between open and closed questions. Closed questions are good if you're trying to get to a specific piece of information or point. And these are generally questions that have yes or no answers, or answers that should be specific, such as how tall are you, when is your birthday. Why questions and how questions, also known as open questions, allow the patient to feel a little bit more open to conversation. They can decide what they do and do not want to share. Oftentimes, this gives patients the ability to lead the conversation to where they are specifically interested in seeking care. What brought you in here today would be a great example of an open question. It doesn't have a specific required response, and it gives the patient room to talk about whatever their concerns are. Another form of questions are leading questions. For example, if you said to someone, "You've had your COVID vaccine, right?" That's suggesting to them that the answer you want to hear is yes. And it's important to be mindful when asking these questions because they may be off-putting to patients if they don't have the answer that you're expecting from them. All therapeutic communication occurs within the frameworks of relationships that have 3 distinct phases. The first is the beginning orientation phase, next is the working phase, and then finally is the termination phase. The orientation phase begins when the nurse meets the client and starts to learn the identity of the client. The roles are clarified, and generally an agreement about what you're going to be talking about is established. Refer back to the previous lecture on explaining intent and inviting consent in lecture 2. The length of the orientation phase will vary depending on the intended duration of the relationship. For an example, a medical assistant in a clinic who's going to be working with a patient for an hour or so will have a very brief orientation phase, whereas a counselor or therapist who plans on spending perhaps months or years working with a client will spend a lot more time in the orientation phase. Next comes the working phase, which tends to be the longest portion of any therapeutic relationship. This is where the client and the practitioner are working together to meet the needs that they've identified during orientation. Interaction is the primary component of this working phase, and generally the interactions are centered around helping the patient achieve a goal, helping them perform activities of daily living, and performing different services on their behalf. Finally, there's the termination phase, and this may occur at a previously agreed upon time, or it may come up spontaneously. And this is when you've reached the conclusion of what you initially agreed upon to work together. Sometimes if you haven't completed the goals with the patient, they might feel some fear or anxiety. They also might feel that way if they've established a particularly close relationship with you. But these are normal fears to be expected, and talking them through these fears can be an important part of the termination phase. I'll be skipping over the 25 success strategies as well as the guide to personal and business writing, and we will be discussing that in part 2 of our lecture. The next resource you have is an example of how to write a business letter. This contains a generic business letter format, which you can also see in this example here. Your contact information goes on the top left, followed by the date, and then the contact information for the recipient of the letter. Next comes greeting to the person you're writing the letter to, and then the body of the letter itself, and we'll be discussing structure of basic writing in the second part of this lecture. The next resource from this week is basic tips for writing business letters, and some of these tips are quite useful. First and foremost, use a spell check, but this is also not a substitute for rereading your work. So I recommend both. I've already mentioned in some of my emails and Canvas messages, but I just want to re-emphasize that Grammarly is a wonderful tool for improving your writing both through spell check and grammar check. The next is to keep things organized, which we will again discuss in more detail with writing structure in part 2 of this lecture. And the same for the third tip, which is include opening and closing statements. Choose an appropriate greeting. Good morning, good afternoon, these are very common. And choose an appropriate closing. If you notice on a lot of my messages, I have warmly Joel afterwards, because that's what I'm trying to convey. I'm trying to convey an open person who's happy to talk to you, rather than something more closed, such as sincerely, which I might reserve for formal writing. The next resource in this week's section is writing business thank you notes. And it gives you some good steps, but what I really want to focus on is when you want to write a business thank you note. I strongly recommend sending in a handwritten thank you note after an interview for a potential position. This is something that will make you stand out from other applicants, and honestly, thinking back of the handwritten thank you notes I've received for interviews, I think I've hired every single candidate that sent one in. Because they're not all that common, and they really do show a personal, caring touch. So if you really want your message to be well received, send a handwritten note. On the other hand, if you have a complaint, I would not recommend handwriting it. Instead, you have some good tips here on how to get your complaint properly handled. And the first thing is to go straight to the top, addressing the complaint to the top person in the company. And that person is generally not going to be the person handling the complaint, but it will make its way to the appropriate department if you send it to the CEO or the president. The next tip they include is to have backup.
All right, a little impromptu location change. One of my coworkers really needed my office. Try to be a team player. So be sure to include backup or supporting evidence for whatever your claims are, whether that be a sales receipt or a copy of communication that you received from someone from that company. Next, be specific. Tell them exactly what it is that you want so you can actually get what you want. Talk up your loyalty and make sure they know what a valuable customer you are. You can include colorful words like appalled, stunned, or shocked, but just don't use more than 3 of them or it'll start sounding hostile. The next tip they include is to make a vague, veiled threat. And this is a little bit playing with fire, but when you really do need to get your point across, this can be a wonderful tool. Just make sure to exercise your own personal judgment about whether or not this escalatory step is worth it. Try to keep your message short. Things that are short and to the point tend to keep people's interests. And finally, spell check and try to end things on a positive note. When I need something done and there's no room for debate about it, I often thank the person in advance for doing what I've asked them to do. The next resource that they give is how to CC in a letter. CC stands for carbonated copy, and this comes from back when we used paper for everything. A carbonated copy was one on the back of a regular piece of paper, where what you wrote on the first paper would show up on the second piece of paper. If you're sending a formal letter to multiple people, you should include the information of everybody who's receiving the letter. The primary recipient is who you'll include up at the top where you would normally put the addressing information. And then finally, below your signature, you'll include CC and put the names and addresses of all the other people who are receiving a copy. This is the formal letter equivalent of the CC field in an email. Next up, we have ending letters. Just as discussed before, there are different endings you can use, from love to your friend to wishing you well. And the ending you choose should be based on the person that you're sending the letter to, as well as the content of the message. In formal business letters, yours truly and sincerely are popular endings to use. The next resource, formal letter writing, is pretty much the same as the previous How to Write a Business Letter. Next, in the email etiquette and do's and don'ts, there are some good suggestions, including avoid using abbreviations and avoid using all capital letters, because that'll sound like you're shouting at someone. Avoid using colorful fonts or different fonts in the same email. Stick to one professional font. Don't overuse punctuation marks, especially question marks or exclamation marks. And try putting a space in between each paragraph so it's a little bit easier to read. Keep your emails short, sweet, and to the point, and always have a signature line so the receiver knows who's sending the message. And finally, if you're including an attachment, let the person know that you're including an attachment. A lot of common email processors now will let you know if you forget to send the attachment if you've already mentioned attachment in the email, and that is a very useful tool. The next resource I want to focus on is the reading comprehension resource. These are some good tips to increase your reading comprehension. First and foremost, remove distractions by choosing a quiet and calm place to read in. Next, build anticipation, or as I'd like to say, build context. You should know what you're about to read by reviewing the chapter title, and oftentimes, if there are learning objectives, those are a great thing to review before you dive into the subject matter. Be an active reader rather than a passive reader. This means trying to contextualize the things that you're reading as you read them. A lot of the times I highlight what I'm reading in order to help myself focus on weeding good information and important information out from what is less important. Once you're done, close the book and try to think back on what you've read. And finally, reinforce your understanding by discussing what you've read with other people, whether that's debating it with them, explaining it to them, or just discussing what you might have gotten out of it. All of these examples might feel a little bit overwhelming, but it's important to remember that Google is your and my friend. Whenever I'm writing a letter, I always look up examples on Google to start from, whether it's about the specific type of letter I'm writing or even just basic formatting. If you're unfamiliar with all the things that I've just discussed, I recommend you go through the material for this week in detail to get a little bit more familiar. But never forget that you'll always have resources at your disposal to figure out this kind of stuff for yourself when you're on your own. The last part of this portion of the lecture is discussing the 7 Challenges workbook for the week. I recommend everyone read through the 7 Challenges workbook in its entirety. And this specific section deals on changing your criticisms into requests. The idea behind this is when you criticize, you're centering the problem on a person, and they tend to get defensive and try and reply back to you somewhat tit for tat. But if you center the issue on a problem that you can both work on together, they tend to want to work with you on that problem. You can employ their help in the issue instead of making them feel like it's their fault. They're less likely to be defensive and more likely to be creative in how they might be able to help you. This is also known as taking a collaborative problem-solving approach. A good way to make sure you do this is to avoid pointing out character traits of someone as a cause of the problem. For example, you are always late. You are a slow learner. You are anything of that sort is probably going to be more of a criticism of someone's character than a request for their help. Instead of focusing the problem on them, you can use language like we statements. We need to focus on meeting our deadlines. And that does not focus the problem on them. It allows everyone to take ownership of meeting the goal of meeting deadlines. Finally, include a rationale for your specific requests. If you're asking for something, let the person know why, because this gives them both context into its importance, and it allows them to think more creatively about how the request might be fulfilled or how they can solve the problem for you. These strategies will make your communication more cooperative than combative, and can go a long way in your personal relationships. So I recommend reading the 7 Challenges workbook in its entirety. That's it for part 1 of this lecture. Next we'll have part 2, which deals with basic writing structure, active and passive voice, as well as the writing process. Thank you so much for watching.